Hello and welcome. This is the Hobbies Podcast. I am your host, Elias, and I'm here with my uh, temporary co host, Carl, and a guest, Theodore. We're going to be discussing language learning as a hobby today. So, how about you two introduce yourselves?
Yes.
Yeah,
So I'm yes.
you start. You start.
Yeah, I'm Taylor, the guest for today.
Mhm.
Mm.
And you have been learning Chinese and Japanese, correct? Have you been learning any other language?
French in school as well,
All
but
right,
yes,
good, good. And Carl, you have been learning Spanish in school, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And all of us we're native speakers of Swedish who have learned English as well in schools, of course. So that is another aspect to take into account.
Yes.
But let's get into it. So, uh, Tira, both of us have both learned Chinese for a while now.
hmm.
How come that you decided to start learning Chinese?
Well, I was inspired by a guy on YouTube who went around in his hometown, going into Chinese restaurants and whatever, and just speaking to them in their native language, and it was
Mm,
really entertaining. Uh,
mm,
and Well, his thing was that it's not hard to learn a different language, so I wanted to try.
mm.
And then I found out that you've also been learning Chinese, and that was also inspiring or uh, motivating.
All right. So you said that it's inspiring. In what way is it inspiring, do you think?
Mm, well, those videos were mostly just very comedic because they were really very like exaggerated reactions from people.
Mm.
Because he was not the type of guy that you would expect to speak Chinese, and then he comes in speaking perfect Chinese. Yeah, so they were very surprised all the time.
Subversion of expectations.
Indeed.
All right. So I guess it
Mm.
might be inspiring because it's like he went through the effort of learning that language despite not having to, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. And then, well, just like spreading some, exp- yeah, just making people, I guess, happy because they were like
Mm.
very happy and glad that someone else has learned their language.
Mm.
That was probably the most inspiring part.
Yeah, so because they had learned a language that they were speaking, they could connect in another way, perhaps.
Exactly.
Yeah, that is
Exactly.
inspiring. What do you think about this, Carl?
Well, as someone who speaks a bit of Spanish and who has interacted multiple times in Spanish, I do think that, or I should say, interacted with strangers in Spanish. I do think that languages can definitely bring people together. I've had a couple of instances where I have met someone who only speaks Spanish, and
Mm.
actually being able to interact with them.
Oh.
You're right. Sorry. Actually being able to interact with them in their own language has really helped.
Mm. All right. So, how, what do you guys think about learning languages in school, for example, where we're forced to, versus learning it on your own? So, Carl, you don't have experience learning it on your own, but Theodore has.
Mm.
So, what do you think the main difference is, Theodore?
Well, it was way easier to at least get into it when I did it voluntarily.
Mm.
So, like, I learned French in school, as I said, and it took me at least a year or two before I understood enough basics to make like educated guesses of what words should be and how it should be pronounced and whatever.
Mm.
But in both Japanese and Chinese, I had well enough intuition to kind of dip my feet into other things within a month or two,
Mm.
which is an extreme difference. And mm, yeah, I just wasn't very motivated to take that in, like take in that knowledge for French as I was for Japanese and Chinese.
Mm.
Mm.
That's good. So, Carl, what is your experience with being not having a choice about learning a language? How was it learning Spanish?
Well, personally, we all went to the same school,
Mm.
and we haven't learned. Um, I haven't learned Spanish, and you guys haven't learned French in the traditional sort of way, um, where our school has been or was it was a little different in how we learned.
Mm.
Uh, but generally, I do not think that uh, I don't think that the method we used was particularly helpful, and I think that having being forced to learn a language, while while it's a good idea in theory, I do not think it is particularly effective in practice. I decided to. I could have decided to continue learning Spanish after uh, the involuntary years of Spanish learning was over.
Hmm.
Uh, and I thought about it for a while because I really do want to become more fluent in Spanish. But at the end, I decided against it simply because felt uh, it felt as if I had been forced into learning something which I actually didn't want to learn.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah.
All right. The reason why I brought it up is because I believe that a lot of listeners might have had an experience like that, which wasn't very positive because they had to learn the language. It wasn't on their own free will. But
Mhm.
we're speaking about the difference of them trying to learn it on their own. And but me as well, I've had very positive experiences learning language on my own. There's the almost instant gratification of learning a new character in Chinese, for example, learning what it means and how to use it. It's just now you always carry this knowledge and you will always be able to know what this character means if you see it on the internet or on a sign somewhere. Uh, and I wasn't forced to do it. I did it on my own accord, and that also feels very empowering. So I think that learning languages on your own, it's something that is going to be so much more positive than the experience you had having to learn it in school, for example.
Mm.
Well, you can have the same experience in school where, oh, I've learned what this word means in Spanish, so now I can understand it. I feel as if learning a language by yourself means that you can also choose to exercise it more often. So if you both decided to learn Chinese on your own, and that is most likely because you feel as if you can use Chinese in your day-to-day life. And if you do that, I also think that it becomes more fun to actually learn a language. Obviously, I haven't tried for myself, but I th- I personally found that being forced to learn Spanish and then not being able to use it as often as I would have as often as I would have liked meant that I could not learn it to on a deeper level.
Mm,
Mm. For sure. I've stopped learning both Chinese and Japanese for now, and that's also because I haven't really found a use for it day to day.
mm,
So after it was a couple of months, I think I stuck to it about half a year or a year uh, for either of them,
mm,
and well, I just lost motivation when I didn't find a use for it. I didn't have
Mm.
that many other people to uh, speak to in these languages.
That
So I
is
think
true.
that's very important.
That is very true. If you feel like the knowledge doesn't have a purpose, it becomes very disheartening to learn it, of course.
Mm.
Um, the way I managed that was also part in the techniques for learning Chinese. So what I've been doing is that I've been following social media accounts where they post in Chinese, and I wouldn't be able to know what these people say if I didn't do the learning, and also just having the exposure of reading their posts and what is going on in their lives. That is going to be exercise for me as well, so that I become better at the language.
Mm.
Um, so I think that something that is important when you're learning a language is that you have to create the purpose yourself, and also that you're allowed to find that purpose. When you learn Chinese, you have access to, uh, well, almost all of China, honestly. That is a large part of the world. And there's also a lot of Chinese netizens, whether they're from China or if they're uh, diaspora across the world. There's a lot of purpose for it if you find the purpose.
Mm.
That's what I think. Um, anyways, so has it been worth the effort? Do you think? Both of you, like
Well,
learning it in school, French or Spanish versus Chinese and Japanese for you, Theodore.
uh, well, worth. I do not think that the school, like French in school, was worth it. It was a lot of work. It took a long time, and as I said, like it took me almost a year to gain the same level of basic confidence that it did in like a month or two for the other languages.
Mm,
So just that was a lot of work for very little gain.
yeah.
Um, and also I didn't find it very enjoyable. So it was more a hurdle to get past in school rather than something to look forward to.
Mm,
So definitely not worth it. The other two languages, uh, I haven't found a lot of value in it, but it was entertaining. So I didn't think it cost me anything either.
mm,
So there I would say it was way more worth. And
all
yeah,
right.
I couldn't. I It is like a nice party trick now. I can read the Japanese alphabets and very basic sentences in Chinese. So it's it's worth something compared to French, which is also quite similar to English and Swedish compared to Japanese and Chinese.
Mm,
So there, it's kind of it's easier to guess, but it's still difficult to be correct.
yeah.
That makes it not as satisfying to learn.
Mm. And what about you, Carl? You feel like it was worth it having to study it in school? The effort that you put into it?
Well, well, I strongly agree with Theodore here. I do not think that it was worth it per se. Um, the the same thought that Theodore had, where it kind of just became a thing you had to do just for the sake of doing it and getting it over with in school. Um, that kind of mentality, I think, is part of what uh, makes me now feel it was uh, not really worth it to learn.
Mm,
Um, I do still think that with a good teacher and a proper environment where you can regularly exercise the language and actually use what you've learned, it becomes uh, way more worth it. You get a bigger payout, sort of, if I can use that word.
mm,
Um, you get a bigger payout for actually learning the language.
Yeah.
Mm.
So this question is more so directed towards Theodore. Do you think that there is enough resources, free resources online to allow for proper language learning?
Uh, yes. Actually, yes, for sure.
Mm,
If you want to find free resources, is not difficult at all. Like you can get into the basics. Like Duolingo is very popular. I don't think that's the best way to learn, but it is free and is very accessible. You can learn the basics quite fast.
mm,
Um, and then there's also resources like language learning chat rooms, where native speakers go in speaking their language to other people learning that language. Uh, and you can use that to like make conversation with a native speaker, and that's uh, very important and something I haven't done enough of.
mm,
Um, so there's definitely resources to be like used or taken advantage of when learning a new language.
mm. Yeah, personally, I've been using Duolingo a lot, in particular for Chinese. I feel like it is quite decent. You learn a lot of characters,
Mm,
um, and they also have these lessons uh, for each module, where you get to learn some kind of grammar point as well, which is a pretty decent structure for learning it. However, Duolingo of course lacks, but there's, for example, on YouTube, there are so many teachers who just upload free material for anyone to watch. So if
mm,
you have a wonder about some kind of grammatics, or how do I express the time, or how do I ask for directions, there will always be that kind of information to find online, especially in YouTube channels. That is where I've gotten most of my language tips from, I believe.
mm.
Um, so, you guys think that more people should give language learning a go?
Well,
Self language learning or language learning through school?
Well,
I
interpret that
assume
as
you
you
mean
will.
right.
But I
So
was considering more so about the voluntary language learning, yeah.
voluntary language learning, yes, I assumed so.
mm,
Um, I think Toller has a lot more to add to this, considering he's done self learning. But
yeah,
I can just say that for me, involuntary learning of a language was not particularly effective, even though I did try to use Duolingo um, to improve myself in Spanish while also learning in school. It I think the mindset that school gave me was not particularly healthy, and therefore I could not learn it as well as I assume I could have if I did it voluntarily.
Mm.
mm.
And
Uh,
yeah, Peter.
yeah, I well, yes, I think that you should give language learning a go, and I think it's not very difficult to like find a language that you uh, like could see yourself using, or like that you could see yourself enjoying learning. Like for example, the main motivation when I started learning Japanese was just to read the alphabet, and
Mm,
then once I started to read the alphabet, then it was very easy to go into like the basics of how do you say hello and how do you say my name is and so on.
mm,
And so that just kind of snowballed into learning more about the language.
mm,
And yeah, it was fun, and it's now quite useful that I can read the alphabet and or well the Japanese alphabet at least. And yeah,
I
it's
suppose
fun.
just knowing the alphabets, you already have a very strong foundation to do further learning in the
Yeah.
language as well.
Yeah. And when I started learning Japanese, you couldn't point your phone at a sign in Japanese and have it written like uh, translated into English for you. You had to
Mm,
actually know the alphabet to translate. And I was quite excited about reading a sign translating it to Japanese that I didn't know, and then being able to use like Google Translate or some other tool to translate it. That
Mm,
was very exciting. So for sure useful, and it was very entertaining.
mm. Chinese is also kind of fun in that way because all of the characters of which the writing language is made up of other characters.
Mm.
So you have these complicated characters, but if you know the characters that they're made up of, you can kind of solve the character like a puzzle. Like, okay, this character means a person, and this character means a roof. Okay, maybe this character means a home. You can kind of
Mm.
solve what it means without actually knowing the character, which is quite interesting. And I think that learning a language that is very different to what you actually know, it just becomes more interesting in that way. You learn
Mm.
to see new possibilities for what communication can really mean. And there's also just the cultural imprints which remain in a language by their native speakers. So, which is also interesting because Chinese is a very analytical language. What does that say about Chinese culture, for example?
Mm.
Uh, but what do you think about learning a language that is very different from your own language? Because, like we said, French is quite similar to English and to
Mm.
some extent Swedish as well, so is Spanish. But Chinese and Japanese are very different.
Yeah, I think that was part of the fun, part of the like motivation that this is so different. Nobody else in my like circles could guess this. I am the only one that knows this. And that yeah, that felt really nice to have something for myself, so to speak. Uh, so yeah, that was fun, and that was mainly why I chose Japanese. I also watch Japanese shows. Uh,
Mm,
so then I also that was very fun that too. When I got to the parts in my Japanese learning that matched up with what I could see or hear in the shows, and I could understand without reading the subtitles. Uh, so that was fun, and I think that's yeah. Well, it opens up for more. Like it opened up for me to understand and to be able to watch more freely without having to have subtitles and still being able to understand what's going on.
mm. Yeah, and that's very good. That's very interesting. Personally, haven't found too many shows in Chinese. I know that there's a lot of animes and similar things, but I've only recently gotten into uh,
Mm.
those kind of media myself. Sorry, I cannot speak. It's only recently that I've started getting interested in that sort of media, so I haven't really had too much exposure like that. But I did learn Korean for a while, and I did in fact watch a few shows, so I can relate to what you're saying. It's
Mm.
you recognize somewhere. It's like, oh yeah, wait, I know this. Yeah. Have you had any experience like that, Carl, with Spanish? I know that Spanish often makes appearances in like American shows and whatever.
Well, in parts, I would say. So I have tried watching completely a show completely in Spanish. Uh, However, I have had to use the subtitles more than I wanted. Um, I haven't had as many of the moments that Theodore told us about, where you can recognize words and understand them without using the subtitles. Um, and that's been a little bit disheartening for me, um, because I hoped that I would be able to understand it more than I did.
Mm.
However, when watching a show in, um, for example, an American show, the if there is Spanish, I have found that it is generally quite simple,
Hmm.
and then I can actually understand parts of it. So that does make it um, quite fun to be able to understand what they're saying, and it does give a slight motivation to continue to learn the language.
Mm. You know, French, I struggled with so much in school. It was very difficult for me, and it didn't at all go as easy as Chinese did for me. However, I did in high school when I had to take French again find a means of making learning the language quite fun, but it was entirely on my own. It was still not related to the materials which the school provided for me because they felt forced. What I did was that I played uh, a game called Dragon Age entirely in French. The dialogue changed, the text, the subtitles, everything was in French. So I had to translate every word that I saw in order to play the game, in order to know what it was that I was telling the characters, because it's a very story and dialogue driven game. So and the things you say matter a lot in this game as well. In particular, if you
Yeah,
say
great game to choose for language learning.
exactly, it's very fantastic in that way because if you say the wrong thing, maybe a character leaves you never to see you again, and that you don't want that. So you want to know what it is that you're saying, and that made actually translating the language quite fun because and also when I continued doing this, I would notice so quickly how much better my French became because I would recognize the words so often because it's a lot
Mm.
of exposure that you get from a game like that. It's a lot of dialogue. Often when you learn language, you go through a sentence a minute maybe. Playing a game like that, I would go through 10 sentences a minute. It was
Mm.
so quick and a lot of exposure. It was almost overexposure, but it did work. And I do recommend to people who might be listening that if they decide to do language learning, that they use a method like this. Like expose yourself to as much language as you can. I did it through a game. Maybe you don't like games. Do it through a show. Do it through songs. Just exposure to as many words as you can. You will eventually, if you translate them, be able to recognize them quite well. I mean, that's
Mm.
how we learn languages as children. We become
Yeah.
overexposed to the language we're supposed to learn.
Mm.
I definitely agree with this. One of our other friends, called Emil,
Hmm.
he actually learned French this way too. He turned the language. I think it was he played Minecraft and he turned the language to French. And I think for him it was quite helpful because Minecraft has a lot of basic tools and such. For example, there is a bucket, and him just learning what bucket is in French could be helpful
Mm.
Mm.
for him later on. And so um, I do agree that this strategy of overexposing yourself to the language with something you like can definitely help
Mm.
to learn a language.
Carl, do you have any questions for me and Theodore? I'm struggling here. Sorry.
It's okay. Um, well, I think we mentioned a lot of what I've been wondering about, but at the same time, I want to ask Theodore if you would consider it getting easier to learn a language after you already know a couple languages, because you said you understand both Japanese, Chinese, a little bit now, but you also understand Swedish, English, and a French. So, will do these languages help you learn other languages?
Mm, that is a good question. I would say yes, but not because the languages like resemble each other, like word for word. Just because like after learning one or two languages, picking up a third is just repeating the same process, and you've already learned that process or done something that worked for you.
Mm.
So I think for that reason, it was way easier. Um, and then depending on what language you learned in French, you could pick out words based on their relations to Swedish or English words because like they're closely related and words have been uh, like shared between them throughout the years. So you could figure out the meaning of words. That kind of applies to Japanese and Chinese too, because some characters have been loaned mostly from Chinese to Japanese. So when I learned Chinese, or when I learned, yeah, exactly, when I learned Chinese, I could see characters that I knew the meaning of in Japanese, but didn't know the like pronunciation for in Chinese. Uh, so that was both helpful and a bit confusing in the beginning. Uh, so for sure, after learning a couple of languages, picking up another one is easier, definitely.
All right. Do you have any final thoughts, Theodore?
Not really. I'm quite satisfied.
All right. Well, I think we're gonna wrap this up then. I think that this has been a very good episode. I hope that anyone who listened might consider language learning as a hobby in the future. And I wish you all a very nice day.